All right, folks, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, and thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. I will post the recording of this presentation and then also the slides under our COVID pages so that you can find them and peruse them at your leisure. Today, we're going to talk about budget planning with ESSER funds. And many of you may have joined the meeting at the request of your superintendent a couple of weeks ago. The commissioner had a few slides that he discussed and about planning and trying to maximize the use of the ESSER funds, and this presentation builds upon that. So the purpose of this presentation is to inform LEAs of a use of ESSER funds to extend those educational supports for students who have experienced learning loss caused by the pandemic, and to prevent the looming funding cliff when ESSER grant funds expire in a few years. Many of you are aware that the ESSER funds do have a shelf life, and we're quickly approaching that shelf life. And so we wanted to discuss another option of how to maximize those ESSER funds. So you can see in my example of the peak or the largest amount of funding in 21-22. And what this shows is the flow of the ESSER funds along with your state and local funds. And in 21-22, you can see that you reach your peak, and then it starts to decline from there. And then in 23-24, when all of the ESSER funds have expired, you dip back down, and then it kind of levels off. And what we built this graph on was local, state, and your ESSER funds. We didn't include any of the other federal funds. We thought it was most beneficial to show you the decline, in particular that decline when it comes to the ESSER funding. And so we're trying to prepare you for the funding cliff that is looming ahead. So today in the agenda, we will go over the federal stimulus funds background. I'll discuss the specific funds that are talked about within this presentation, and then maximizing the use of those ESSER funds to extend the educational supports. Of course, if you've seen me speak before, I don't go many places without talking about FIRST. And so there's some FIRST indicators specifically that I wanted to address because ESSER funds may have an impact on them. And then some frequently asked questions at the end in the FAQ that Corey Green and his team have put together for ESSER 1, 2, and 3. I pulled some questions from there because I think that they're important to highlight. And so we'll go over a few of those as well. So federal stimulus funds background. The funding streams that we will be discussing are the ESSER 1, so Fund 266. That was the very first stimulus funds that the federal government released, and then followed by the ESSER 2 funds, so Fund 281. And then finally, the ESSER 3 funds, and also the ESSER supplemental funds, so Funds 282 and 283. I did not include the ESSER 3 funds, the T-class portion. I just kept it with Funds 282 and Funds 283. So these are the three big funding streams that are being discussed throughout this presentation, and I wanted to highlight those for you. So on this slide, you can see that the different periods, the availability periods across the top in the first bullet point. So ESSER 1, the availability is from March 13th, 2020 through September 30th, 2022. I was doing a presentation yesterday, and a federal programs director highlighted for the group that your ESSER 1 funds are about to expire. And so if you haven't used those ESSER 1 funds yet, you need to make sure and find an allowable use for those ESSER 1 funds pretty quick before they expire. We would hate to see that those funds be returned back to the federal government. And then a link to the ESSER 1 information specifically on our webpage. And then the bottom bullet, I just highlighted about approximate percentage of how much the ESSER 1's funds were of your total budgeted revenues. Then you can see the middle column, ESSER 2 funds, had the same starting period, so March 13th, 2020, and they go through September 30th, 2023. So you have about a year and a half left of maximizing the use of those ESSER 2 funds if you haven't already used those. And then once again, a link to the specific page for ESSER 2. And then the ESSER 2 amounts, the allocation amount was about 15% of your total budgeted revenues. And then finally, ESSER 3, also with that March 13th, 2020, you have a little longer time span for them, which is September 30th, 2024. Once again, the link to the ESSER 3 page. And then what we did for the presentation, and I may repeat it again just to highlight that, we assumed a 2/3, 1/3 drawdown. So we assumed a 2/3 drawdown for fiscal year 22, and that was approximately 20% of your total budget revenues. And then we assumed a third of a drawdown, or the final third drawdown in 2023, and that's about 10% of your budgeted revenues. All right, use of ESSER funds. The LEAs will determine when and how to use those funds. So that's ultimately up to the LEAs and their local decision on when and how to use their funds. If y'all remember, ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 were used to partially offset ADA hold harmlesses provided by the state. So in 1920, there was a hold harmless, and then also in 2021, there was a hold harmless, and those portions of ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 were used to offset, partially offset those. However, and I had many conversations, especially with the ESSER 2 funds, LEAs had the option to not recognize that offset, or they could have only recognized a portion of the offset if they had money built into their fund balance, or the way that they built their budget. Maybe they could offset some of that, what would appear to be a loss. That was their choice. Maybe they were trying to maximize their ESSER 2 funds for all in 21-22. That was really up to the local LEA and their decision. But that was a choice that they could make, or many of you did use the ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 to offset it, and that was perfectly fine as well. A key point is that bottom bullet point. All three of the ESSER grants allow for supplanting state and local expenditures, but you do need to keep in mind, and you'll hear me repeat this over and over, that as long as the expenditures have to meet the intent of the ESSER grant, and it had to be related to COVID or the pandemic, is an allowable activity of the grant, so one of the three grants, and it's supported by documentation. So keep in mind that whatever you choose to use those funds for, you do have to have the documentation to support that. So following along those lines, just to stress what the use of the funds, so that we don't lose sight of that, the funds must meet the intent of the ESSER funds. And the intent is to address the impact that COVID has had and continues to have on the elementary and secondary public schools. And the funds are clearly related to COVID-19. So keeping those two things in mind, you're encouraged to focus on addressing the digital divide, learning loss, and then activities associated with implementing plans for the return to normal operations. All right, so many of you are aware of the state flexibility that we've tried to provide in these last few years. And when I talk about state flexibility, I'm talking about the state allotment spending compliance. So pre-COVID, we relied on Fund 199, and then and then determined how you coded things to your program intent code, such as bilingual, state comp ed, special ed, GT. And so we would focus on 199 with the PIC spending. Well, once COVID happened, there was still an expectation that you would serve those students. However, because you can supplant state and local funds, we have since combined Fund 199 with Fund 266, 281, and 282 and 283 for testing compliance. And so for the 21 school year, because of the hold harmless, we are encouraging you to look at the summary of finance run ID 33209, which is your actual student counts. And so for the 21 school year, we're asking for you to use that run to look for compliance. And then that bottom bullet was a question that I felt like it kind of helped explain what we were doing. And so I wanted to provide it for you guys. This particular district said that they were hiring a reading interventionist to assist with their at-risk students. They coded the position to 282 with a PIC 30. For those of you that aren't in the weeds of what PIC 30 is, it's Program Intent Code 30, which is a state comp ed used in relation to a Title I school-wide campus. And so they go on to ask, if they're understanding me correctly, they would, in calculating the 199 spending compliance, am I allowed to expense the code to Fund 282? So that's ESSER 3 and PIC 30 to meet the annual spending compliance. So my response was, yes, that's correct, because we are combining 199 with Fund 282 to be able to determine the spending compliance. And so I felt like this was a good example of what the top bullet point was explaining. Okay, with that said, though, now we're gonna switch gears to the federal fiscal compliance.
I didn't get that. Could you?
And so the four federal fiscal compliance areas that we'll discuss in a little bit more detail is the IDEA B, LEA, MOE, the ESSA MOE, the Title I Part A comparability of services, and then the final bullet point down there is the local MOEquity, and that's part of the ESSER 3 funds. So IDEA B, LEA, MOE applies to any LEA that accepts grant funding authorized by IDEA B statute. It's 100% compliance test. If you spend $100 of state and local funds and services in special education, so think about those PIC codes, PIC 23, PIC 33, and PIC 43. And if you spent $100 in those PIC codes in fiscal year 2021, then you must spend at least $100 in fiscal year 22 to meet that compliance. And remember, for all of these federal compliance areas, you cannot use your ESSER funds to meet the federal compliance portions, except there's an exception on the last one, which is related to ESSER 3, and we'll talk about that on that slide. But for the first three that we'll discuss, you cannot use your local funds to, or your ESSER funds to meet that calculation. And that's what the third bullet is saying. You cannot include any of your federal funds. And then if you need more information on the IDEA B MOE calculation, then that you can go to their webpage, and they've got some really great information there for you to use. So for ESSA MOE, that applies to any LEA that accepts grant funding authorized by the ESSA statute. So generally Title I funds. The ESSA MOE is a 90% compliance test. So if an LEA expended $100 of state and local funds in fiscal year 21, then in fiscal year 22, at a minimum, that LEA must spend $90 in fiscal year 22. And so you could actually build on that in other years by continuing to keep the spending at 90% of that previous year. And then that third bullet point, once again, is going to highlight that this is another one of those spending federal compliance areas that you cannot use your federal funds. And then the bottom bullet point is links to the ESSA MOE webpage, and then also the ESSA MOE calculation tool, which are also really good resources for you to utilize when you're trying to make these types of decisions. And then the third federal compliance area that I wanted to highlight, Title I, Part A, comparability of services. This applies to all LEAs that accept Title I, Part A funding. The LEAs that do not meet the exemption criteria must demonstrate that they have budgeted a comparable level of state and local funds for their campuses receiving Title I, Part A, versus those campuses that don't receive any of the Title I Part A funds. And then once again, you can only use your state and local funds, so Funds 199 and Funds 420. And this was another one that does not include the federal funds. And then finally, that fourth area that we wanted to highlight for you was the local maintenance of equity, that if you receive the ESSER 3 funds, you're subject to this calculation. And if we go to that third bullet point, the LEA MOEquity includes both funding and FTE components. The funding components include state and local funds only. All federal funds are excluded. So this one also excludes the federal funds. However, when you're doing the FTE component, so when you're looking at your FTEs across campuses and across your district and charter, you will include all FTEs that are federally funded. So you'll include both state and local and your federally funded FTEs. And then the bottom bullet highlights that you must not reduce combined state or local spending per funding or per pupil FTEs in any of the high poverty campuses by an amount that exceeds the average in all campuses in the LEA or in the grade span. All right, so now that we've got those federal compliance areas out of the way, you saw that the state compliance does include the federal funds. The federal compliance areas does not include the federal funds. We wanted to highlight those first so that when you're thinking about how to maximize your ESSER funds, that you first meet those federal compliance areas before you move more and more of your cost over into the ESSER funds. And so we wanted to highlight those so that those are available to you. And now we'll move into what we're talking about as far as maximizing your ESSER funds. So the following information describes one method of strategically utilizing the ESSER grant funds to extend those educational interventions, because the ESSER funds will expire. And so we want to make sure that we can maximize all of the ESSER funds before they expire. And so this also will be able to extend those supports beyond the life of the ESSER funds. And then it also will help the district in financial planning for the long term and supporting their students. And then the bottom bullet point highlights that the LEA and their school board ultimately has the decision making, and it's up to them to make the decision that's best for their district and supporting their students. All right, so if you remember the slide that I showed early on where the blue line was, and I just showed you the blue line. This graph expands beyond that. And so what I wanted to highlight was this was an example of how the expenditures were going to flow based on a school year, and then based on how the ESSER funds were going to flow to a particular school district. In this case is XYZ. And so you can see the bottom blues are all state, so M&O, and then the orange are all M&O tax collections, so your local funds. And then the yellow is your ESSER 1 funds that you receive. So you receive those in about 1920, unless you haven't expended them. And then so your district may look a little different than our example. And then in 2021, you could see that the ESSER 2 amount was utilized. And then like I highlighted, for 21-22 and 22-23, we took a 2/3 approach of using our ESSER 3 funds in 21, and then a 1/3 use in 22-23, and then that left our district seeing this cliff kind of come to a screeching halt in 23-24, and then we were left with back to our state and local funds, and so it may be hard to utilize any additional funds to continue those educational supports. So keep this in mind as we reference the funding cliff. We wanted to highlight that for you guys. All right, accounting for ESSER funds. Because the ESSER funds allow for subplanning and recognizing expenditures all the way back to the beginning of March 13th, 2020, that means that you have expenditures in other fiscal years that you can use to reimburse the operating funds of the district or the charter. The LEA would recognize activities as long as those activities relate to the pandemic. So once again, we're highlighting those 4 key components before you move costs. We really want you to think about how they relate to the pandemic, the intent of the ESSER funds, so utilizing it and trying to help students catch back up, that the expenditures or expenses are allowable and is supported by documentation. These funds will be audited, and so having that that support is a key when being audited, to be able to provide that support to the auditors when they ask for that information. And then that bottom bullet point, if I've talked about the last few years, the timing of ESSER funds doesn't always line up with your fiscal years. And so the first part of that sentence talks about if you receive federal revenue after the expenditure happens, so it's a more of a reimbursement. So if you're crossing over your fiscal years, then you would recognize that federal revenue in the operating fund if that was the fund that incurred the cost. So you had some pandemic related expenses going back to March of 2020. They were related to the pandemic. They met the intent of the ESSER funds. They are allowable and they're supported by documentation, and you can seek reimbursement for those in the current year. However, you would record that revenue in the current year in your general fund, and then you would work with your auditors to recognize that on the CFA, which is your schedule of expenditures of federal award, and there'd be a reconciling item. And many of you have heard me say that before, but I wanted to continue to highlight that for you. And then, of course, if it's a current year expense or expenditure, then you would just record it in one of the ESSER funds, 266, 281, or more likely 281 or 282 now. And then I wanted to provide a sample of a journal entry. I've been getting some questions about how it looks from a journal entry perspective. And so I might have oversimplified it, but I wanted to at least highlight it for you to make you think about it. In my example, a district spent $1 million on air filters. You typically we use local and state funds, but these air filters are are much better at filtering the error, and they can filter out some of those smaller components that maybe are floating around that could be COVID related. And so I'm using error filters as my example. You can replace that with whatever you choose. So the typical recording would have been, you would have expensed it, and then you would have had the cash out. So debit expense, that increases your expense. You credit the cash, that lowers the cash because you bought the air filters. So with ESSER funds, the air filters, assuming that they're an allowable item, they met the intent, they were related to COVID. I have documentation. Therefore, I'm going to code them to my ESSER 3 fund. So ESSER, I'm going to fund 282. Then I'm going to still code it to the same function and expense account. And then I'm going to credit the cash. And then on the general fund side, I'm going to debit the cash because I got the reimbursement from the ESSER funds. And then I'm going to credit my expense because I've moved it over to the ESSER side. And then now when I get my reimbursement from ESSER's Fund 282, I would record it as cash because I received the cash as a reimbursement. And then of course I'm going to credit the revenue to increase the revenue to reflect that reimbursement. So this was just a simple calculation that I wanted to show and highlight for y'all. So you would have an example of what a journal entry may look like. And I see that there's some questions. I'm going to wait till the end to answer them, just to make sure that I have time to get through the presentation. But I do plan on answering some of the questions if I'm able to answer those. All right. So going back to what we've been talking about. So with my example now, I've freed up some of my state and local funds. So that moves me into, if I'm freeing up my state and local funds and I'm really maximizing those ESSER funds, then this allows for me to save some of my state and local funds. And by saving those state and local funds, if you look down at the bottom, the gray boxes under 21-22 and 22-23, you can see that I can use my state and local funds now to extend those educational supports farther out. So I maximized my ESSER funds in 20, in fiscal year 21, fiscal year 22, and fiscal year 23. I saw the benefit of that maximization because I'm allowed to supplant my state funds and my local funds with ESSER funds, as long as those expenditures that I moved are allowable and meet the intent. And so you can see in our example that we saved 50 million in general fund balance across 21-22 and 22-23. And that allows the LEA to smooth out those expenditures over the next 3 years, so we can continue those supports for our students beyond the life of the ESSER funds. And then on this chart, I wanted just to show you what the original chart looked like. So you can see the blue line is the original chart where we didn't plan for any kind of budgeting or spending. We just spent all the ESSER funds all at one time. And then the orange line highlights the focusing our attention on spending, and you can see that it eases that funding cliff and allows for us to plan those supports even beyond the life of the ESSER funds. All right, so like I said, most of my presentations, I include a little bit of first because it has an impact on both charters and school districts. And in this case, I'm not doing my whole first presentation that I do, but I did highlight some indicators that I thought of that what we're suggesting by maximizing the ESSER funds and being able to extend those student supports beyond the life of the ESSER funds, how it may impact some of these first indicators. And so I wanted to highlight those for you. And then this also opens up the discussion with your board as well on discussing some of these first indicators with them. So the first indicator that I thought of was indicator 6, fund balance, or for the charters, it would be their net asset balance. So generally the indicator is asking about your assigned and unassigned fund balance. And if you had a 25% change over 3 years, or if your assigned and unassigned fund balance was greater than 75 days of operational expenditures in the current year. The operational expenditures is defined by all of your expenses minus function 81 for the school districts, or for the charters, it's all their expenditures minus depreciation. So at a minimum, and if y'all remember, this is a ceiling indicator. This is one of those indicators that is new. And so at a minimum, we're encouraging you to have at least 75 days of operational expenditures in your assigned and unassigned fund balance. And then at the bottom, for your consideration, so by practicing of what we spoke about just a minute ago and what this presentation is about, so planning and maximizing your ESSER funds in order to extend those supports further out, you would increase your fund balance for this indicator. So that's going to help you in meeting this indicator, especially if you're one of those charters or school districts that are close to having less than the 75 days of operational expenditures. So this helps you in planning ahead. This helps you get back on the right footing. And so it's something for you to consider as you're working through your budget and planning and looking how your budgeting and your financial practices are going to impact first. And then the next one was indicator 10, budget to actual. So a few things on this one. This was a new rating. We made a change to this rating. We're not going to score it for the 21-22 fiscal year. But I wanted to highlight this, even though we're not going to score it because of some of the difficulty of the flow of the federal stimulus funds. We still think that it's one of those that you should pay attention to, that you should go through the calculation, discuss this with your board to show them how the revenues that you budgeted for versus your actual, how that's impacted. And then of course, how the ESSER funds have impacted that. And then as you're working through your budgets for this year, which many of you are starting that process now, or you may be waist deep in it. So it's one of those things that you can be looking at of how the ESSER funds impacted your budget for this year. And then as you're making some of these changes that we've talked about, how that's going to impact your budget in the following years, because this indicator is a 3-year indicator. And so in this case, it looks back 3 years, but you can see by looking forward, it's going to help you plan for going ahead and securing your budget and the solvency of your school district. And then indicator 13, this one I flagged. The agency hasn't made a determination yet of how we're going to utilize this indicator, but I wanted to flag it because of what we've talked about in this presentation and being allowed to supplant your local and state funds. So background first, this is an administrative cost ratio. So we're going to compare your administrative functions, so 21 and 44, as they're compared to 11, 12, 13, and 31, which are those student support functions. And so, and then, as you're aware, based on the size of your school district and or charter school, there's a ratio to meet based, and then on the point scale. And so, if you code all of your teachers, so that would be function 11 to Fund 282, and we were to run this calculation our traditional way, which only uses 199, that would cause more than likely that would cause the district or the charter to fail this indicator, because they did what was allowed by the federal funds and move funds over to the one of the ESSER funds. And so wanted to flag this because of that situation. We are trying to help you identify ways and support you in supplanting your local and state funds. And so we at the agency are flagging this one. A couple of options we have about how we would try to adjust for this indicator would be combining ESSER with 199, or we may just grant everybody 10 points. Of course, we like to see the data beforehand before we make that decision, but we are actively looking for a solution for this indicator. Indicator 15, the ADA projections. This, as many of you are aware, trying to project your ADA has been something of we've had a difficult time these last few years. And this particular indicator for the school districts uses the biennial pupil projections that you submit in the fall before the legislative session. In fact, you'll have one that's coming up for later this year. You'll have to do your pupil projections of your school district. And then for the charter school side, we use your summer projections as it's compared to the actual ADA for that year, for that school year. This is one that we've already flagged as well, because we've identified the difficulties in projecting those, projecting the ADA. And so this one has been waived. So you'll just be granted 10 points for that. And then finally, this particular indicator is one that has gotten a lot of lost for words here. Sorry about that, folks. So this particular indicator, we've had a lot of changes to it. Originally, if you remember when we created it before HB3, had you talking about the lag between state and local values. And then we've had all sorts of changes between there. So now this year, one of the things that I'm suggesting that would meet what we're looking for this particular indicator is having a conversation with around maybe the slides that I've created, or the slides that were in the commissioner's talk from March 24th, where you're talking about how you can, as a district, budget maximizing your ESSER funds and trying to extend those student support services beyond the life of the ESSER funds. And so that's what we would be looking for in this indicator, and this indicator provides you that option. Like I said earlier, many of you are either starting the budget process or you're waist deep in the budget process. And so this may be one of those things that you discuss with your district in one of the next board meetings, because it is, if you're a June 30, then you're well within the 120 days of adopting your budget, and you do have to have that conversation beforehand. And then from the perspective of what the agency would look at from this, we would just look for some sort of slides or an agenda item, or in one of your budget books or budget workshops, we would see if there was some kind of documentation to reflect that conversation. All right, lastly, I only pulled a few of the frequently asked questions from the FAQ that Corey Green and Matt and their team has created, that has lots and lots and lots of questions over the ESSER funds. And so I wanted to highlight a few of them because they relate to this topic. They also are highlighting that these aren't brand new questions that we've created. These are questions that we've already had in there that we wanted to encourage and for you guys to think about as you're planning the use of your ESSER funds. So the first question, how can we address potential fiscal deficits in future years? And so that talks about this entire presentation. You have the option to supplant your state and local funds with ESSER grant funds. Remember that they have to be allowable, they have to be caused by the pandemic, meet the intent, and have documentation. So having those things, then yes, by planning ahead, maybe even using some of the things in this presentation, this allows for you to help do that. And that's essentially what this answer is saying. And then the next question asks, how could the MOE requirements impact the LEA expends on ESSER funds? So if you remember going back into those federal fiscal compliance areas, doing those calculations before you decide to move over a big swath of, or a big chunk of your state and local expenditures, going through those calculations and making sure that you're meeting all of those federal compliance areas before you do it is what we're trying to encourage you to do here in this question. And then this question is, now that we can supplant state and local funds with the ESSER grant funds, what should we do with the unexpended state and local funds? So that talks about having a conversation with your board. You've made the decision that you have some state and local funds that that you're able to reserve. So between you and the board, you could either have those funds restricted, you could have them committed, or at least at a minimum, I would assign them as a purpose and not leave them in unassigned. That way you can reflect and highlight that you're identifying these funds to extend the student supports beyond the life of the ESSER funds. And then this question is, what is an example of changes I would make to expenditure codes in the event my school system use ESSER grant funds for allowable purposes that are currently being funded with general fund dollars? So the top part of this just discusses, similar to what my example was, you received $1 million in ESSER funds. You could reclass all $1 million of allowable expenditures in the general fund to the new ESSER fund code, so 266, 281, 282. And then in essence, that leaves some funds in your state and local that may not be used, and so then you may restrict those over, like what we talked about in the previous Q&A. Or the bottom one talks about planning for the use of those ESSER funds over a number of years. I think in the case it was a 3-year period, and not doing an all at once calculation and moving over, but incorporating some ESSER usage with your state and local funds and being able to still restrict those funds and add those funds to your fund balance to continue those supports for the students after the ESSER funds have expired. And that's what the bottom bullet point is. So the first part of the answer is all at once. you save the funds, and then the second part is using a 3-year grant period to be able to move some funds over and commit those funds into your fund balance. And then how could my LEA reserve the state and local funds that were supplanted by ESSER for future uses to continue to educate students? And so this is still talking about that the same idea that we've had throughout this presentation. And it just goes into some detail about restricting, designating, committing. And so I won't spend as much time with this one. All right, so my final slide are just some things for you to think about to avoid the ESSER caused fiscal cliff. And so avoiding the ESSER fiscal cliff, things for you to think about. How are you building a budget for the long term to avoid that sharp decline in funding when your ESSER dollars expire? And then of course, sustaining the ESSER impact. How are you organizing your resources in ways that enable new ways of working to continue long after ESSER dollars are exhausted? And then this is a unique opportunity. You can supplant locally with your ESSER funds. And so how are you crafting your budget and your fiscal strategy to extend beyond the life of the ESSER funds? And so I wanted to leave you with this slide because this is highlights what the entire presentation was about, was trying to get you to think about the financial strength of your district or charter and being able to long-term support those students after the ESSER funds have expired. And then this is my contact information. That's my direct office line, and of course my email. And I see that I have a few questions. I'll see if I can. All right, well, first one is, I should have known I get that question every time. I'm going to post the presentation, it's recorded, and I'm going to post my slides on the COVID webpage close to where you registered for this presentation at. And so I will post that there. What is considered appropriate documentation? Something like this. 158, let me guess. Might have been the air filters. The documentation wise, if they have a higher SEER number, maybe the filters you purchased talk about have some research that shows that they're airplane quality air filters. So whatever that documentation is that's going to support that they're going to help provide more fresh air for the school district. It really the point of that was that those the expenditures that you're coding into ESSERs are going to meet the guidelines and meet the intent of those ESSER funds. And so that's what the documentation purpose is. So on this other question, can you please speak on how and when to use the TA allowable use of fund justification form? So I am on the state side, the local side of it. I'll pass this question along to the federal program side. That's going to be their side. So under Corey Green's shop. So we'll work with them to get an answer to that one. Can I clarify what the accounting would look like to recognize the offset, and can it still be done now, even though the offset happened in 2021 funding? The offset, I think now you would just recognize expenditures that you had that could support the funding, much like what you've done when there was a timing issue. And so it would just be, you would recognize federal revenue, so the 59 series in General Fund 199. And then on the CFA, you would have a reconciling item that shows you had some federal reimbursement that happened in a different fiscal year. All right, so I answered that one. I got another question about the justification form. Okay, the assumption is that the legislator will not increase the basic allotment next session, correct? I won't speak for the legislator. They will have their own. They make their own decisions, so I'm not going to speak for the legislator. I don't have any response for any of the questions that are related to what the legislator will do. I don't have a crystal ball. So on this question, they're asking about my example of the air filters can be supplanted, not just the marginal cost for the better air filters. In this case, my example was the entire cost of the air filters. Specifically, I would leave the specifics on if the difference between the two. That's going to be a program question for them to answer. Can you elaborate on indicator 10 budget versus actual? Is it a certain percentage that we would have to meet? So for the indicator 10 budget to actual, we compare your budgeted, so the budget items at Snapshot, which is your PEEM snapshot, versus the actual revenues that come in at the end of the year. That's over a 3-year average, and there's a 10% variance there. So you're not having to hit it right on dollar for dollar. It's you can either be short, so you could have, it could be 90% of your budgeted revenues to actual revenues, or vice versa. And then the next year, that same ratio, but flip the other way. And then however that averages out over the 3 years, there's a 10% variance there. And then on back to the offset, if you missed the hold harmless, no, the revenue, the ESSER funds are still available for you to spend down. I believe so. I don't think that ESSER funds is lost revenue. And back here. Couple of these questions here are more for the program side, so I'll forward these questions onto them and see if I can get some help on those, and we may address them in their FAQ that I've spoken about several times, that has a huge amount of information in it. And if you haven't perused it in a while, I would suggest that you do, because it's a great resource. They've worked hard at trying to keep it up to date, and it's constantly being updated. So some of these questions that I'm unable to answer, because they're so specific to the ESSER fund side that you may see them over in that FAQ. All right, with that, I'm going to end the presentation. So I'm giving you back a few minutes. Certainly, if you have questions that pop up, I'm happy to try to answer them to the best of my ability. I don't know the answer. I'm happy to work with the federal program side or try to find an answer for you. I appreciate y'all's time today. And thank you for all that y'all do in supporting the students of Texas.